Well, good day, and thank you for being here to listen to my podcast, Human Trafficking and What the Church Can Do About It. And I'd like to start my presentation with the words, once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was Maria. She stands on a street corner, scantily dressed on a cold Johannesburg winter evening. Her eyes scan the passing traffic, and she's not keen to engage in conversation, although she seems grateful for the hot cup of coffee offered to her by a street worker. Maria is a commercial sex worker in the south of Johannesburg. She has a pimp and lives in a brothel. She was offered a job in Johannesburg via a niece and traveled alone against the advice of her parents from the Eastern Cape. Once in the city, she discovered that the nature of the job was prostitution. She cannot leave because she doesn't have enough money to pay the fare home, and because she's addicted to drugs and needs the daily fix they provide. There's also Sophie. They are usually huddled together on the pavement that forms an island in the busy road. The older woman is always accompanied by two small children. On Sunday mornings, they make their way into the church for worship. The children lead the blind woman to a vacant seat near the front. Just before the conclusion of the service, they leave quietly and return to their assigned task for the day, begging on the street corner. Sophie is one of many beggars on the street corners of Johannesburg. These beggars are blind, many are elderly, and they're accompanied and led by children in their work. They're given accommodation and are taken to their posts in the morning and collected again in the late afternoon. They are given food, but all their proceeds must be handed over to the establishment. Sophie is from Zimbabwe and believes herself to be lucky to have been brought to South Africa because she's been promised an operation that will restore her sight. She's not in possession of her passport or any other documentation. It is not clear who the children are that accompany her. Then there's Christina. She agrees to meet at a small coffee shop. She tells us her story of terror. She was deceived by someone within the agency she worked for, transported across 1,000 kilometers and forced to work as a prostitute until she was desperate enough to risk a dangerous escape. Does she have AIDS? Is she pregnant? She doesn't know. She refuses to report her story to the police because she has received threats from her traffickers. Then there's Jennifer. She's brought to the shelter for victims of human trafficking with a laptop, computer, a mobile phone, and very little else in terms of worldly possessions. A Zimbabwean citizen, she was lured to South Africa by a businessman who offered her a large salary to work for him as his assistant. She traveled to Johannesburg in possession of a valid passport and visa, both of which were taken from her upon her arrival, expecting to enter a very normal and pleasant working environment. The work she was required to do was indeed of a business nature as a private secretary, but she was locked in her apartment at night and did not receive any payment for her work until she escaped 3 months later. Then there's Celeste. She stands fearfully, surrounded by a small circle of women in the city center of Johannesburg. They seem concerned and agitated as they discuss her situation in a language she doesn't understand. She's just 7 years old and lost in a strange country, a small foreigner amongst strangers. She was taken from her remote village in Mozambique by a friend of the family without her parents' permission and brought to Johannesburg. She somehow became separated from her abductor and was found and helped by a group of street walkers. The reason for her abduction was never discovered. These are fragments of some of the stories that make up the human face of this presentation. These real people, their names and some of the details changed to protect their identity, illustrate some of the different forms of human trafficking. We at the Anti-Human Trafficking Task Team in South Africa met each of these women personally, either through the Salvation Army helpline or through some other means. Here's the big question for today. Why and how should Christians respond to modern slavery and human trafficking? Here are some of the questions we will ask along the way. What is known about human trafficking in South Africa? What does the Bible say about challenging and responding to injustice? And how did the church respond to slavery in history? In my study, I used the Loyola Institute of Ministry Research Design, which typically moves from a description of a given situation as it is, through a biblical theological description of how the situation should be, to a suggested practical response that could help to move the current situation and reality closer towards the ideal situation. I'm 100% convinced that the church can make a significant difference in the struggle against human trafficking. In the next few minutes, I'll provide an overview about human trafficking in South Africa. The globally accepted definition of human trafficking is provided by the UN's Paloma Protocol, published in the year 2000. It divides human trafficking into 3 segments, named as the act, means, and purpose. The act of human trafficking is defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. The means of human trafficking include the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or in the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person. The purpose of human trafficking is exploitation, which includes, at a minimum, the exploitation of the prostitution of others, or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. That's quite a mouthful. So here's a very simple definition provided by the International Justice Mission. Human trafficking, or modern slavery, is the illegal trade in human beings for the purpose of exploitation. Having provided clarity in terms of a definition of human trafficking, it's also important to understand what human trafficking is not, especially in the current climate marked by the migration of thousands of people from war-torn countries. A summary of the difference between trafficking of people and smuggling of people will be necessary at this stage. The crime of human trafficking may at times be confused with that of smuggling of persons. The difference will be briefly explained in terms of border crossing, documentation, relationship, purpose, and type of crime. In terms of border crossing, human trafficking may take place across borders or within borders, even within the same town, same street, or same building. That is called internal trafficking. Whilst the typical purpose of smuggling of persons is to transport them illegally across borders. In terms of documentation, in cases of human trafficking, documents may be genuine, false, or stolen. Sometimes there is no documentation required for human trafficking at all. However, in the smuggling of persons, if documents are used, they are typically false or stolen. If genuine documents were available, smuggling would not be necessary. In terms of relationship, in human trafficking cases, the relationship between the trafficker and the victim is a lasting one, based on coercion or force or threat. The smuggler, on the other hand, has a contractual relationship with the persons being smuggled, which is usually initiated by the person being smuggled and ends after payment has been made and the act of smuggling has been completed. In terms of purpose, the purpose of human trafficking in all cases is exploitation. The purpose of smuggling is to transport a person across a border without being discovered. In terms of the type of crime, human trafficking is a crime against an individual. The crime of smuggling is a crime against a state. It is easy to see that what starts as a smuggling situation could potentially be exploited to become human trafficking. Reliable statistics are hard to come by, partly because of the hidden nature of the crime and also because different organizations tend to disagree about the correct figures. Today, the Global Slavery Index, a worldwide study on slavery published by the Walk Free Foundation, is a helpful tool and provides a clearer picture of the dimensions of human trafficking. According to the index, South Africa ranks at 110 out of 167 on a worldwide scale of countries affected by human trafficking. And based on 2016 figures, an estimated 155,000 people are living in modern slavery in South Africa. On a worldwide scale, the index estimates that 40.3 million people are living in modern slavery, of whom 71% are women and 29% men. Children make up a significant percentage of both these groups. International and South African studies agree that human trafficking is a flourishing and often highly organized criminal trade in human beings. These studies indicate the changing nature of the face of human trafficking, including the global movement of migrants and refugees that has become a worldwide crisis, leaving many people vulnerable to exploitation both by traffickers and smugglers. The inclusion of targets towards an end to human trafficking in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals is significant. Human trafficking is mentioned in numbers 8, decent work and economic growth, number 5, gender equality, and number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. South Africa started working on a law against human trafficking in 2008 under pressure of the international community in the form of a ranking system devised by the US Department of State, which placed South Africa at the time on its Tier 2 watch list in that year. Further pressure was caused by the prospect of the 2010 FIFA World Cup that was going to be hosted in South Africa and the links between international sporting events and human trafficking. The Prevention and Combating of Trafficking in Persons Bill was signed into law in 2013. In the ensuing years, South Africa has fluctuated between Tier 2 and Tier 2 watch list. You may well ask, how does any of this impact the church, my church, or even me as a Christian? Almost all international and South African studies conclude that lawmaking and or law enforcement cannot solve the problem of human trafficking on its own. This should be of special interest to the church. The clear indication is that there is much to be done that can only be accomplished with the help of civil society on grassroots level. The church, being situated in the very center of communities, has knowledge, power, and resources that would be well spent in cooperation with other parties to prevent and reduce slavery and human trafficking. Having provided a basic introduction into the nature and scope of human trafficking, the next section of this presentation will briefly describe the biblical reflection that underpins this presentation and provides the situation as it should be. But in searching the scriptures for God's heart on slavery, one faces a challenge and is inevitably left to wonder what, if anything, the Bible really says about slavery. On the surface, the Bible appears to advocate for freedom and yet appears to accept slavery. References to slaves and slavery present a theological maze, perplexing and full of apparent contradictions, leaving the reader confused and bewildered about its actual message. I found it helpful to focus on a specific passage. There are many examples that could have been chosen, like Joseph in the Old Testament, or Onesimus in the New Testament, or the children of Israel in Egypt. But after some reflection and study, I decided to focus on the person of Jesus, his mission for his own life, and his message for his followers. I selected Luke chapter 4, verses 18 to 21. The words of Jesus in Galilee, teaching in the synagogue and reading from the scrolls of the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Known as the Nazareth Sermon or the programmatic declaration of Jesus, this passage contains the first sermon of Jesus in the Gospel according to Luke, outlining his mission statement and the purpose of his coming, with reference to Isaiah 58 verse 6 and 61 verses 1 and 2. In studying these passages, the first question one might ask is about the mission of Jesus, and the second question is about the mission of the church. Then we may think about whether the mission of the church is the same as the mission of Jesus, and if so, the question that will arise will be how God's people should respond to the crime and justice of human trafficking. I've chosen Luke 4 verses 18 to 21 as the focus text for the study for several reasons. It contains a clear statement of the purpose and life of Jesus in his own words. It includes several references to freedom and liberation, which I hope will help to answer some of our questions. It contains elements of the law and the prophets in the Old Testament, linked with the life of Jesus in the New Testament, and the today statement at the end reaches beyond the Old and New Testament into the lives of its readers of all times, even our lives today. And here are some of my conclusions. In this passage, Jesus extends the mission plan of God in relation to the children of Israel in the Old Testament to the mission plan of God for all humankind throughout all time. We learn that the mission of Jesus is a holistic mission of word and proclamation, according to verses 18 and 19, and deed in the form of bringing release, freedom, and salvation, according to verse 18, to the poor, the prisoners, the blind, and the one oppressed in the realms of the spiritual, social, moral, and physical. What about the mission of the church? We consult the Gospel of John, chapter 17, verse 18, and find that the mission of the church, the sent, is the mission of Jesus, the sender, who was sent as he was sent by the Father, and that our mission too is one of word and deed to the poor, the prisoners, the blind, and the oppressed in every sense of the word. When looking into the church response to historical slavery, I was expecting to find a substantial and robust Christian and church response against historical slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. I had thought that this part of my research would be easy, but found quite the opposite, both in terms of slavery in antiquity and this transatlantic slave trade. I found that the Christian voice against slavery was in fact less powerful than I had expected. Slavery in late antiquity was so embedded in society that it was generally viewed as a natural state of existence, that some people were free and others were slaves. There were a few isolated voices who opposed this view and who reasoned that slavery was in fact the result of sin. Their discomfort about slavery did not, however, lead them to call urgently for its abolition. The transatlantic slave trade, I expected some resounding Christian voices ringing out against the slave trade, but was again disappointed. Instead, I learned that the earliest Christian voices were raised in around 1673, while the transatlantic slave trade began in the 15th century, making the church rather a latecomer on the stage of the abolition struggle. According to some sources, many church leaders, and in fact the churches themselves, owned slaves. For instance, on church-owned plantations in the colonies. It appears sadly that the churches of the time did very little to minister to the slaves until nonconformist missionaries began to do so in the early 19th century. They experienced great resistance from plantation owners who feared that the rise of black Christianity, as it became known, would be a threat to slavery. Their fears were grounded. Along with the gospel, slaves also received literacy and education, and the groundwork was laid for a whole new wave and form of Christianity and theology. But that is for another day. We turn from history to today, and the question is about a global slave trade that we call modern slavery or human trafficking. How does and will the church fulfill its contemporary mission in confronting human trafficking, a criminal act that still enslaves human beings and robs them of their right to freedom, turning them into merchandise or property? Returning briefly to the stories of Maria, Sophie, Christina, Jennifer, and Celeste, the question may well be asked, is there or could there have been a way home for them? Perhaps an even better question would be, is there a way in which their traumatic journeys could have been prevented, and could the church have been part of this prevention? I propose the following model of response. This graphic model that you will see in a few moments is entitled Celeste's Way Home and uses the example of Celeste, the little girl found in the center of Johannesburg. The model indicates firstly the centrality of the victim. There you see Celeste. The importance of the team, surrounded at all times by support by the team. Then there is Celeste's journey, the grey section being her trafficking experience and the colourful part being her journey with the team to be reunited with her family. And finally, the impossibility of the task if it were to be undertaken in isolation and without numerous partners. In the case of Celeste, these partners include government agencies, non-government agencies, professionals and experts, as well as groups and individuals representing civil society in finding a way home or to a safe place for victims of human trafficking. The persons and institutions within the circle are church-based, while those outside the circle are outside of the church, but no less important. How do we go about formulating a response to human trafficking? It's always a good idea to begin by focusing on the foundational realities of strengths and limitations of the church. One of the strengths of the church is its presence at grassroots level in communities around the world. In cities, towns, and even the remotest of villages, the church is present. A second strength lies in its good name and the trust that the public, many governments and other agencies place in its integrity and capacity to make a difference in matters of social justice. A third strength may be called the approval of heaven and the firm belief that God is on our side. There are many things the church can do, including raising awareness, education, training, advocacy, caring for victims and survivors and their families, addressing the root causes of poverty, inequality, and prejudice, to name but a few. However, there are many activities that are outside the scope of the church's mission and capacity. These include lawmaking, law enforcement, border control, criminal investigations, arrests, trials, sentencing, international negotiations, and more. Even though each incident of human trafficking is different, and each victim and survivor will have different needs and require a bespoke response, I want to lay down the broad strokes of a framework or a model within which it will be possible to respond meaningfully to the issue of human trafficking in the context of teamwork and keeping the victim or survival central to the process. The proposed requirements of a response are as follows. A response must be person-based. It is important to offer a response that keeps in view the fact that every occurrence of modern slavery happens to a person, someone's sister, mother, brother, father, daughter, or son. A response must be Bible-based. It must be rooted in the biblical principles of love, justice, respect, protection of the weak and vulnerable, and the right of fullness of life for all people. Partnership empowered. A response must include cooperation, which is vital for any effective response and will include partnership between like-minded denominations, organizations, agencies, and specialists. It must be learning enhanced. It's important to conduct and share ongoing research and documentation. Impact focused. Some questions the church will ask to measure the impact of its efforts will be whether they are helping to decrease the number of victims, whether training provision is sustainable and increasing capacity for action, and whether awareness-raising campaigns are appropriately targeted. Strength-driven. The church should continue to do what it does well, and that is to address the root causes of human trafficking, poverty, and the lack of social economic security. Advocacy enriched. A response to human trafficking should not be limited to treating the symptoms of human trafficking, but should also include the upstream work of advocating for just structures and systems. Motivated by the love of God and the example of Jesus. Jesus was in his earthly ministry concerned about every aspect of human suffering, and he not only valued human freedom, but also gave his life to make freedom a reality. As believers, our struggle against human trafficking is based on our firm belief that God's love compels us in our efforts. This next section contains the key areas of a Christian response to human trafficking. Whilst all of the above requirements should be present in any Christian response, this is not the case with the key areas. Rather, churches and congregations will focus on one or more of the key areas according to their capacity, location, and mission priorities. At a workshop held in 2016 by the Salvation Army and the Anglican Alliance in Nepal, the original 7 Ps model was introduced and documented. The first 3 areas of response are in the Palermo Protocol of the UN, and a 4th was recommended by the USA's Department of State Trafficking in Persons Report of 2012. 3 further areas were considered important by Salvation Army Consultation Group, and the last one was just recently added. Here then are the 8 Ps, or 8 key areas of response. This framework is the work of the Salvation Army's International Anti-Human Trafficking Task Team. Let's start with prevention. The preferred way to combat anything undesirable is through prevention. Because of its unique position in communities, the church can be a powerful instrument in prevention, utilizing at minimum only its basic existing structures. Prevention initiatives may range from awareness campaigns, days of prayer, anti-trafficking or freedom Sundays, and fundraising. Protection. This area focuses on victims and survivors. When victims are identified, they need protection in terms of a safe exit from their situation and access to a place of safety where they may recover. Emergency support, short-time accommodation, basic supplies, care, and friendship are well within the scope that even the smallest congregation could offer. Proof. Ensure that our response both contributes to and receives from research. Policy. The church must be part of conversations about matters of national and international policy pertaining to human trafficking, labor laws, laws relating to children's rights, and other laws. Churches and their members may also do well in reviewing their own consumer policies and habits in terms of ethical purchasing of coffee and other products. Partnership. No single movement or organization can fight against human trafficking by itself. Some of the most important partnerships the church should have are with the police, prosecuting authority, social welfare, as well as foreign embassies. Prosecution. Calling traffickers to account for their actions is an important part of combating human trafficking. Churches can help by encouraging victims not to be silent, but to call on and cooperate with law enforcement in the prosecution of traffickers. This encouragement may take the form of accompanying victims to police stations and courts of law, and of preparing them for court hearings and supporting them through sometimes extended periods of legal proceedings. Participation. Even the smallest congregations in the remotest of places may be successful agents of change, helping to prevent human trafficking and creating safe and robust communities. Activities well within the remit of the church may include calls to prayer, Freedom Sundays, peaceful marches or demonstrations, campaigns and training events, as well as sharing information and resources. And then prayer. Prayer is central and foundational to all Christian service and has been named as the bedrock of every effort of Christians to work for justice. Brueggemann describes prayer as a refusal to settle for what is, and writes in his book Interrupting Silence, the very fact of prayer is a way to remain courageous, a way to resist resignation that would result in losing heart. The church is called to prayer as her very basic response. As I reflect on the journey of the Salvation Army in Southern Africa in the early years of this century, I have the joy of having been a grateful fellow traveller and the benefit of hindsight. Much of our journey was a roller coaster ride, being catapulted from one stage of the journey to the next by increased knowledge and information, by the need and by the open doors of opportunity, and the response was often more pragmatic and intuitive than strategic. Plotting the journey and noting the lessons learned with hindsight really highlights the need for strategic thinking and planning. I'm convinced that any Christian group or congregation can design a very practical and effective response to human trafficking and modern slavery. I believe that the journey starts with prayer. After prayer, a vital part of planning a response is research. Churches may wish to conduct their own research, or they may engage the services of others who specialize in research. Funding is often available as part of a larger project for thorough research by specialized organizations. Some of the research will take the form of desk research. This includes academic research of literature, and in the case of human trafficking, much of this literature is web-based because of the relatively new nature of the subject and because of the ever-changing nature of human trafficking. Books are difficult and cumbersome to update, and it's easier to remain current with web-based resources. It will also be necessary to take research into the community, whatever that community may be. It may be the community of a suburb or village, or it may be the community of a denomination or an organization. It is my experience that responses are more robust and sustainable if they include grassroots input in planning and research. Research will include the issue of human trafficking and how it affects the population in the area concerned. It will also include an inquiry into what other agencies and organizations are doing in the area and how they are responding to human trafficking. Other possible stakeholders like police personnel, schools, health services, community leaders, groups and other churches and communities of worship will also be included in the research. It will be desirable to interact with these individuals and groups and to establish common ground and the possibility of working together and sharing resources. After prayer and research, take an inventory. Ask the question that Jesus asked his disciples in Mark 3 verse 38 when they faced a hungry crowd. What do you have? In terms of people and their passions, skills and time, in terms of resources such as access to funding, infrastructure, vehicles and more, in terms of partners, remember you can't do this alone, ask the question, what do you have? After prayer, research, and inventory, a detailed action plan should be designed step by step. Decide the what, how, by whom, by when, and how you will measure success and impact. After prayer, research, and inventory, the detailed action plan should be ready for implementation. William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, looked at a situation of need in his day and environment, and his words were, "Go and do something." I echo these words today. Go and do something. The stories of Maria, Sophie, Christina, Jennifer, and others have touched our hearts, broken our hearts, and filled our hearts with a longing for justice. This study endeavors to answer the question of how Christians should respond to the crime of human trafficking by means of the Loyola Institute of Ministry Research Design, starting with an empirical description of the situation in South Africa and following on with a biblical theological description of the mission of Jesus and the mission of the church. My study suggests a framework of practical response that could help to move the current reality of exploitation of human beings closer towards the ideal situation of freedom for all. The stories present the church with a question and a challenge. The question concerns how the heart of God responds to these and millions of other lives affected by human trafficking. The challenge is how His people will respond.